And we're back on a Sunday night like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Sunday evening here with me in New York. Once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Well, it is a movie anniversary, and once again, I was taken by surprise. We have a big box office movie with two one legend, well, they're both legends, but legends of a different type. Big movie stars in a big sweeping romance, a cornball, schmaltzy movie that began as something else entirely. And I have mentioned a concept which one of the stars of this film is a movie in which I mentioned this in reference to, but in two separate episodes. One episode about the Cary Grant, Grace Kelly, Sir Alfred Hitchcock, To Catch a Thief. That's a movie about a jewel thief on the French Riviera and the hot girl that he tries to get with or does get with, and is he still stealing the jewels? And you got all of these plot machinations back and forth. But ultimately, To Catch a Thief is not a movie about a jewel thief trying to romance a really hot American who was not long for the movie business in Grace Kelly. It is a film about two movie stars. And then, fast forward to the late 1980s, a film that I discussed as part of the Guilty Pleasure series, Tequila Sunrise, starring Kurt Russell, Mel Gibson, and half of the big stars in the movie we're going to talk about tonight. But Tequila Sunrise, with Michelle Pfeiffer and Kurt Russell and Mel Gibson, on the surface is about a drug dealer who's trying to go straight, or in the case of Mel's character, trying to stay straight. And the fucked up aspect of that movie is that the drug dealer is the nicest guy in the entire film. That's not so easy to do. But that's not really a movie about a drug dealer trying to go straight, or a restaurateur who falls in love with the FBI agent who's trying to bust his best friend, the drug dealer. That's a film about three movie stars. Well, the genesis of that quote was not To Catch a Thief. It was not Tequila Sunrise. It was 7 years after Tequila Sunrise, when the famed producer, Scott Rudin, who I want to say he won Emmy, Oscar, and Tony. I think that he may have gotten two of the EGOT. I'm not sure of that. I know that he was nominated for multiple Oscars. Anyway, he was upright. He won for No Country for Old Men. Sorry. Scott Rudin got involved in a movie. It was supposed to be a biopic, a movie about a female telejournalist, quite famous and controversial in her day, named Jessica Savage. S-A-V-I-T-C-H, not Savage like Macho Man. Oh yeah, Savage, S-A-V-I-T-C-H. And she was somewhat of a tragic, ill-fated figure and would have made for an interesting movie. So, a husband and wife writing team, Joan Didion Dunn and John Gregory Dunn. They're related to Griffin Dunn, the actor, of course, from American Werewolf in London and many other films, After Hours, the Scorsese movie. They got involved with a project that was going to be a Jessica Savage movie. And John Gregory Dunn details in painstaking fashion the story that I'm relating in shorthand, that Joan Dunn and John Gregory Dunn got involved in this. It was supposed to be Jessica Savage project. And the book that John Gregory Dunn ultimately wrote about the movie business and his experience attempting to make this film was called Monster. And Scott Rudin was involved with this project, and they kept asking for rewrites, and Michelle Pfeiffer was going to play Jessica Savage. And at a certain point, they rewrote the story to a point where it was no longer really about Jessica Savage. And then before you know it, here comes Robert Redford, the other, one of the two legends, Michelle Pfeiffer, of course, being the other. Here comes Robert Redford on board, and Scott Rudin is no longer interested in making a movie about Jessica Savage now that he has Michelle Pfeiffer, a big A-list star at the time, an Oscar nominee a couple of years earlier for Love Field. Not a very good movie, but she gives a great performance. We're no longer making a movie about Jessica Savage. It's going to be a kind of nameless character. We can call her whatever we want, but it's not Jessica Savage. And John Gregory Dunn, as outlined in this famous book of his, one of the best books ever written about the absurdity of the movie business, he says, well, if we're not making this movie about Jessica Savage, you're saying that we're going to have a romance between the character Michelle's playing, who's supposed to be Jessica Savage, and Robert Redford's character. Yeah, but that didn't happen to Jessica Savage in real life. Nothing like that took place in her career. Yeah, I know. Scott Rudin says, we're not making a movie. This is not going to be a hard-hitting expose about telejournalism, about anything. There's not going to be any hard-hitting elements in this story. Now that we got Redford, it's going to be a fictional story. It's going to have a couple of elements of Savage's life, but this is a fictional story. At which point, John Gregory Dunn asked Scott Rudin, he was a little frustrated. He'd been working on this already for like a year and a half. Well, what's this movie about, Scott? And Scott Rudin said, this is a film about two movie stars. Up close and personal, released on this day, March 1st, 1996, 30 years ago today. It seems to be a movie about journalism, about an old school reporter named Warren Justice, great name, played by Robert Redford, who has kind of fallen from the big time, but he still has a good nose for stories, and he wants to make it back to the big time. It seems to be about journalism, and you have Michelle Pfeiffer, the Jessica Savage character is not Jessica Savage. Her name is Sally Atwater, but she goes by Tally. Her professional name is Tally because Tally kind of rolls off the tongue easier. There's a lot of discussion of optics, both visually and orally, and how certain things sound better and just look better and are more presentable on television. So for all of this talk about journalist ethics in the movie and trying to cover big breaking news stories, and let's go to a prison and let's see if we can maybe have a little danger and win a Pulitzer Prize or an Emmy or something, this ultimately is a movie where Michelle Pfeiffer and Robert Redford make goo-goo eyes at each other. Spoiler alert, they fall desperately in love. At its core, this is a movie about two movie stars. It is a film about two great, legendary names in the business, Robert Redford and Michelle Pfeiffer. And also, spoiler alert, this movie is not a good movie. It is a big 32% on Rotten Tomatoes. Now, that's a lot better than some of Stallone's guilty pleasure movies like Get Carter and The Specialist, checking in at 11 and 12% on Rotten Tomatoes, respectively. But not to make light of Robert Redford's passing, I was devastated when he passed last September. I didn't even know that he had been ill. I thought that his health, again, you get into your mid to upper 80s, a lot of things can go wrong, but I thought he was doing okay, and I was devastated when he passed. But after he passed, CBS did like a round table with a lot of different reporters. Was it Gayle King may have been on there, and Al Roker, and there were a whole bunch of people, some of whom I didn't know and others I did, and they were going over favorite films from Robert Redford. And there was one humorous moment where a gentleman I don't remember, I think a CBS news reporter who just happened to be sitting in as they were doing a round table about Robert Redford, and they were talking about some of his famous movies, at Butch Cassidy, The Sting. One guy said The Natural is my favorite movie of all time. This is terrible. And then another person said, and he had the salad dressing. And then everybody froze, and one woman said, the salad dressing, that was Paul Newman, that was his friend. And the guy was so embarrassed that he got Redford and Newman confused, but it showed how intrinsically linked they were. But one person on the panel, it may have been Gayle King, I'm sorry if I got this wrong, her favorite Robert Redford movie was Up Close and Personal. I love that Al Roker said Sneakers. Al Roker, I don't know if he said it was his favorite, but he said, that might be my favorite movie from Redford. I love that film. And then a couple of other people said, oh yeah, that was the one with Sidney Poitier and Ben Kingsley. Yeah, that was the one in the late River Phoenix. So the fact that anybody would put this in Redford, forget top tier, that this is your favorite Robert Redford movie? I mean, you got to be kidding me. I hope nobody said it. Nobody said it was their favorite Michelle Pfeiffer movie. I mean, I'd put Ant-Man 3 above this. But at heart, this is a classic story of mentor-protege, where they're opposite sexes, opposing body parts, if you will, and it is pretty obvious that this is going to be a love story. And Celine Dion had the song, was it because you love me, because he loved me? You know, Celine Dion at those Oscars, she had a whole bunch of movies that she was up for, and then the next year was the year of Titanic. But there was one moment, I don't know if it was the Oscars of 96 or 97, but Billy Crystal made a joke, and he made a joke that somebody else's song, it was going to be performed by Celine Dion, and they flashed to Celine in the audience, and she had a look of shock, like, what the hell, nobody told me this. And then she realized that Billy was just fucking around and was just putting her on, and she had such a look of relief. You could probably find that clip. And that song will be performed by Celine Dion. Cut to Celine Dion looking horrified and realizing Billy just made a joke at her expense. So the movie, which they ended up making, was by design, it was safe and bland and predictable. It was not the risk-taking movie that John Gregory Dunn and Joan Didion was her maiden name, set out to make, and the screenplay that they worked on. Now, as much as John Gregory Dunn does an awful lot of complaining about this whole process and then the movie Up Close and Personal, in his book, they made a shit ton of money. Yes, they got fucked with. Yes, they put in enormous amounts of work for a project that did not happen, which, yeah, that has to be really, really bad. You know, I could point to my own fledgling career, and I could show you a lot of projects where I did a shit ton of work that wasn't necessary for projects that ended up not getting made at all. At least this got produced. So the story proper is that you have this young reporter, obviously very photogenic, you know, no judgment, Michelle Pfeiffer, old school glamour, a great actress. You know, she was offered Silence of the Lambs before Jodie. That's how high up she was in the industry. And I guess, I don't remember if Michelle ever read a script and didn't like the script, or whether she wasn't familiar with the book. I don't remember the mechanics of it. I just know that she was the first choice to play Clarice Starling, and obviously you don't throw it back. But it would have been an interesting dynamic, you know, in the kind of multiverse, if we reboot The Matrix and Michelle Pfeiffer ends up playing Clarice. I mean, does the movie still win all those Oscars? Did that film work better because of the particular magic that Jodie Foster had with Anthony Hopkins? I mean, I don't know. I'm just taking a guess. I'm speculating, but I do know that Michelle Pfeiffer was in play for that, and there were other big roles of the era which she ended up not taking. But you can't throw that back either, because she got the Oscar nomination for Love Field, and many people think she should have been nominated for supporting actress for The Age of Innocence the following year. So she has that look, the old school glamour, the eyes, the face, the smile, and there's nothing wrong with her performance. There's nothing wrong with Redford's performance, and I'm sure Redford had some input. The thing with Redford, he was very direct. He wasn't afraid to give people his opinion, but you couldn't find anybody who was going to say anything negative about him anyhow. But most people who collaborated with him, even William Goldman, in the story I told in the episode on the movie Misery, where Redford and Beatty were both heavily involved and dropped out because they wouldn't include the scene where, spoiler alert, Annie cuts the bottom of his leg off in the book. But Redford, I'm quite confident, had input and wanted there to be higher stakes for his character in particular. And they end up doing that, and the movie kind of has a climax that you're not expecting, where the stakes are higher. But the way that Redford's character of Warren Justice is presented, it makes sense that this is not a guy who wants to be a regular newsreader. He never wanted to be that kind of talking head. Like, it gets into a little bit of the territory that the James L. Brooks film Broadcast News got into almost a decade earlier. I mean, many would consider that to this day James L. Brooks' finest film. But in that movie, the William Hurt character is a guy who is basically a newsreader, but he wants to do more than be a newsreader. He's great on television. As Redford says about Michelle Pfeiffer character in this film, she eats the lens. She Eats the Lens is another way of saying there are certain people who just belong on TV or in film. There are people who just look good when the camera is rolling. And no shit, Michelle Pfeiffer looks good when the camera's rolling. It reminds me of one of the worst films of the decade, of the 90s, the previous year, Fair Game. The second adaptation of Paula Gosling's novel Fair Game in 10 years. The first one being Sylvester Stallone and George Cosmatos did the movie Cobra. But Roger Ebert trashed the movie Fair Game. Right? He didn't like it. It was terrible. It was Billy Baldwin, the least controversial Baldwin brother. It was Billy Baldwin and Cindy Crawford kind of making I don't know if it was her film debut, but it was an actual role in the film. She plays an attorney who gets targeted for assassination. And when Roger Ebert gave his review with Gene Siskel on their program, Siskel and Ebert, Roger said, I really wanted to like this movie. Cindy Crawford is very photogenic. That is about as on the nose of a comment. You think so? You think she's photogenic? That'd be like somebody saying that Michelle Pfeiffer eats the lens. No shit. That is such an obvious thing. But we go with it. And truth be told, Redford and Michelle Pfeiffer do have good chemistry in this film. They seem to be enjoying each other. You feel like it feels like a real romance. It doesn't feel like something that's tacked on. And we've seen movies where the romance is not really, it's set up as a primary component, but the actors just don't seem that comfortable around one another. And there have been movies where there was a lot of static between the leads, such as supposedly Richard Gere and Deborah Winger didn't really get along that well while making An Officer and a Gentleman. Whereas on the other hand, she and John Travolta in Urban Cowboy supposedly had an affair, so you'd think that they had some good chemistry, but I didn't think they had good chemistry at all in that film, whereas Deborah Winger and Gere, they looked like they were into it. They really did. So good acting, if you want to call it that. So the romance kind of works, but it's very pat, it's very safe, it doesn't take any chances, and the movie ended up being a box office hit. It got to 100 million. So there is a list. I mean, this is idiotic. There is a list of every movie that ever grossed $100 million. It's not an endless list. I mean, it's a lot of money, whether it's today, whether it's 1996. But they managed, the studio managed to get the film over the $100 million mark. And I don't know whether that was just a feather in the cap. I feel like there was something that they were going to get some kind of extra points on the back end if the film hit 100. It was something stupid like that. But I saw this movie in theaters, and it was a letdown for me. It was a letdown for me. It was a letdown because of how much of a fan I am of Robert Redford, and he was capable of better. But one of his previous big films that he was in, Indecent Proposal, that's a film, the first half is fantastic, and then it completely goes off the rails. This movie is pleasant. It's entertaining. It's a trifle. But given the strength of the cast and given the fact that they started off intending to make a serious movie, they went for the biggest box office. They didn't take any risks, and that's unfortunate. Whereas Indecent Proposal took a lot of risks in the setup. Suppose I would offer you $1 million for one night with your wife. Well, I tell you to go to hell. Yeah, no, you won't, buddy. No, you won't. You're going to say yes. That film took a lot of risks in the first half, and then the second half, it just became nonsensical. That's a film that could have been an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and ends up being like a 6 out of 10. But Up Close and Personal is the kind of movie I would recommend people to see because of the star power on display, and there is something to be said for the old school glamour and great stars like Michelle, who was, still very close to the A-list, and Robert Redford, who was leading man material until, he went even further. He was playing leading man kind of roles as late as, The Last Castle in 2002. And because he was Robert Redford, quote unquote, he was able to make other movies such as, was it not The Old Man? There was The Old Man and the Gun, but the movie where he gets lost at sea, I forgot the name of it, where it's just him. He's the only actor on screen for the entire movie, and it's one of his best performances. So Up Close and Personal, when I think about it, it's not that the movie is amiss. It's that you wonder if they had just decided to make the film that they intended to. It would have been Michelle Pfeiffer gunning for another Oscar nomination, and it would have been no Robert Redford. But a lot of people love this film, and the fact that it came up a bunch of times with various people talking about their favorite Robert Redford movies. Perhaps I'm being overly harsh because I was such a big fan of Redford, and Michelle Pfeiffer too. I mean, she's phenomenal in The Witches of Eastwick. She gave great performances, Dangerous Liaisons, The Fabulous Baker Boys, Tequila Sunrise, like I said. Going forward into the early 2000s, she is really good in White Oleander, a challenging, a very difficult, painful movie. A Deep End of the Ocean, another really painful movie where her character, it's about a child getting taken. Just a bruising, brutal movie. Good performance there by Treat Williams, the late Treat Williams as well. So I guess we'll just say a happy 30th to Up Close and Personal. I believe the filmmaker was Jon Avnet. Ironically, one of my scripts ended up with, he didn't read it, but ended up with his producing partner, Jordan Kerner, and allegedly they really liked it, but they had a different baseball project in development at the time, or at least that's what they told me. So they said, this is a really good script, but, thanks, but no thanks. But Avnet's direction of this film is solid. He knows what he's going for. He's not trying to give too much, to think about. The stars look great. The chemistry works. And, the music and everything. A lot of people bought the soundtrack when it hit CD. There were some other kind of good songs in addition to the one that Celine Dion. So, yeah, Up Close and Personal. A couple of big hitters in the supporting cast, Stockard Channing and Joe Mantegna, but barely remember them. All I remember about this movie is Michelle Pfeiffer's character trying to make inroads in the, be a telejournalist in the network news business. And here comes Robert Redford's Warren Justice. I just can't get over that name. Warren Justice, one last shot at the big time, and let's just see what happens. And let's go ahead and make a movie about two movie stars, Up Close and Personal, 30 years old today, a film about two movie stars. I'll spare you the extended wrap-up and just wish you all a happy and pleasant rest of your Sunday night. Peace.